three separate facts from three different decades, with nothing obvious holding them together. Why did Ronald Reagan hang the Presidential Medal of Freedom around the neck of a man who spent the 1930s writing letters to Leon Trotsky about how to bring down the American government? What does a dry 1932 study of who owns shares in large corporations have to do with the fact that you cannot add a room to your own house without the approval of someone you will never meet, who cannot help you, and who did not write the rule? And when the Supreme Court finally struck the hardest blow against the administrative state in 40 years, why did the power it clawed back land in the hands of people who have never once stood for election? Those three questions have one answer. It was written down in 1941 in a book that sold well, unsettled George Orwell badly enough that he built a novel out of it, and then vanished so completely that you have almost certainly never heard its name. The answer is not the one you have been arguing about your whole life. It is quieter, and it is closer, and by the time you can see it clearly you will notice that it has your face. Get comfortable. Stay to the end, because that is where you find out why wanting to see through all of this is the one reflex that keeps it running. Add free versions of these episodes live on our Patreon, Meridian Labs, which this channel is part of. Members get episodes early and an audio feed for listening with the screen off. Subscribe or join if you haven't. Let's ease into it. In the spring of 1983, in the East Room of the White House, Ronald Reagan draped the Presidential Medal of Freedom around the neck of a man who had spent the 1930s trying to overthrow the American government. The man's name was James Burnham. Reagan called him one of the people who had most profoundly shaped the way America understood itself and the world. The cameras recorded a frail figure, 77 years old, still recovering from a stroke, accepting the highest civilian honor the United States can give. What the cameras did not record, because almost nobody in that room would have said it out loud, was how strange the scene actually was. 4 decades earlier, this same man had been a committed revolutionary Marxist. He had corresponded directly with Leon Trotsky. He had helped run an American Trotskyist party dedicated to the destruction of capitalism. And in 1941, in the middle of the Second World War, he had published a book arguing that it did not much matter who won, because capitalism and democracy were both already finished. And a new ruling class was quietly taking control of every advanced society on Earth, America included, the Soviet Union included, Nazi Germany included. All of them, he said, were three faces of the same thing. The book was called The Managerial Revolution. It was a genuine bestseller. It was reviewed everywhere, argued about in every serious magazine of the day, read closely by George Orwell, who was so unsettled by it that he built the world of his most famous novel partly out of its predictions. And then, over the following decades, it quietly disappeared. Not because anyone refuted it, because what it described was too uncomfortable to keep looking at directly, and because the man who wrote it became inconvenient to almost everyone, and because the one writer who later took the idea further than Burnham ever did ended his life as something so ugly that burying him became a convenient way to bury the whole framework along with him. I have spent an unreasonable amount of time with this material, and I want to tell you what is actually in it, because I think it is one of the most underrated ideas of the last 100 years, and because once you see it, you cannot stop seeing it. It changes how you read the news, it changes how you understand your own job, and it ends somewhere I still do not fully know how to think about. The story you know about power goes something like this. At the top sit the rich, the owners, the people who hold the wealth, the major shareholders, the billionaires whose names you already know. Below them, everyone else. The workers, the salaried, the people who sell their time by the hour or the year. Politics, in this version, is the long argument over how much the people at the top get to keep and how much flows down to everyone else. The left wants to move wealth and power downward, the right wants to protect the people who hold it, and whichever side you happen to take, notice that you are taking it inside the same frame. Owners on one side, everyone else on the other. That is the map almost all of us carry around in our heads. That is the map every political argument you have ever had was drawn on. Burnham's central claim, the one that got his book slowly buried, is that this map describes a world that stopped existing somewhere around the middle of the 20th century and that nobody ever bothered to redraw it. The owners are still there. The billionaires are real. But somewhere along the way, he argued, they quietly stopped being the people who actually run things. Power detached itself from ownership. It came loose. And it reattached itself to a completely different group. A group that owns almost nothing by comparison, that you cannot vote out of office because it does not hold office. That appears on no list of the richest people alive, and that has been running the actual machinery of every modern state and every large corporation for the better part of a century. You interact with this class constantly. You depend on it. You may well belong to it. And you have almost certainly never once been told its name. Which brings us to the question this entire story turns on. The question Burnham spent the rest of his life circling and never quite escaped. If the people who own no longer rule, and the people who rule own almost nothing, then who is actually in charge? Not in theory. Not on the organisational chart. Who genuinely holds the power in a society like the one you are sitting inside of right now? It sounds like a simple question. You would expect it to have a simple answer. It does not. And the reason it does not is, in the end, more disturbing than any single name Burnham could have handed us. Because the harder you look, the clearer it becomes that this new ruling class is almost impossible to see. Not because it hides in the way a conspiracy hides, because of what it is actually made of. And by the time we reach the end of this, I suspect the hardest part for you will not be identifying these people. The hardest part will be that you already recognize the description. You have met them. You have worked for them, or as one of them. The call, it turns out, may be coming from inside the house. Hold on to that discomfort, because we are going to earn it slowly, and I do not want to hand you the ending before you have seen the evidence that makes it inescapable. Start with something small, because the scale of this thing is easier to feel from the bottom than from the top. Think about the last time you tried to do something perfectly ordinary and ran into a wall. Adding a room to your own house, opening a small business, getting a diagnosis you needed, enrolling a child somewhere, getting a permit, a license, a certification, an approval. In every one of those situations you eventually came up against the same experience, and it is such a universal experience in modern life that we barely notice how strange it is. There was no one to argue with. There was no person who had decided your case and could be persuaded to decide differently. There was a process. There were requirements. There was a form, and the form had been designed by someone you would never meet, according to rules written by someone else you would never meet, and the human being in front of you, who may well have been sympathetic, had no authority to change any of it. That person was not the power. That person was a terminal, and behind the terminal there was another terminal, and at no point in the chain was there a face. That experience, the one where you go looking for the person in charge and find only more procedure, is the single most common encounter an ordinary citizen of a modern country has with power. And it is worth noticing that it looks nothing at all like the picture you were given. In the picture, power is a rich man in a room deciding your fate. In your actual life, power is a requirement that nobody remembers writing, enforced by someone who cannot waive it, on the authority of a rule that exists in a document you have never read, which was produced by an office you could not name. You have run into this 1,000 times. Every single time you were touching the ruling class, and every single time you walked away with the impression that you had touched nothing at all, because there was no one there to be angry at. That is the texture of it from below. Now consider what it looks like from a distance, over the course of a single human life. Take someone born in 1940, the year Burnham was writing. In the world of their childhood, the number of things you needed permission to do was small enough that most people could hold the list in their heads. You could build a shed. You could open a shop. You could give someone a haircut for money. Over the following 80 years, without any single dramatic moment, without a coup, without a revolution, without any election ever being held on the question, the number of activities requiring credentialed permission expanded until it covered the great majority of what a person can do with their own time and property. Nobody voted for that. Nobody in particular decided it. Every individual step of it was proposed by reasonable people for reasonable reasons, and almost every step of it, taken alone, was probably defensible. And the sum of 80 years of defensible individual steps is a society in which almost nothing can be done by an ordinary person without the prior approval of a credentialed professional. That sum has a name, and the name is the thing Burnham was trying to hand us. The reason the sum feels invisible is that nobody ever experiences the sum. You only ever experience your one permit, your one form, your one requirement, at your one counter, on your one bad afternoon. The class that produced all of them is never in the room, because it is not the kind of thing that can be in a room. And a power you can only ever meet one form at a time is a power that never has to defend itself in public, because it never appears in public at all. I want you to hold that ordinary frustration in mind as we go, because everything else in this story is an attempt to explain it. Not the drama of billionaires and politicians, which is the part you are shown. The other part, the counter, the form, the rule, the person who cannot help you, the absence at the centre of it where the decision maker should be. That absence is the subject, and something should bother you before we go any further. This is not fringe. Burnham was not a crank shouting on a corner. He was a Princeton graduate, an Oxford man, a professor of philosophy at New York University for over 2 decades, a founding editor of the most important conservative magazine in America, and, at the end, a recipient of the Medal of Freedom from a sitting president. The idea we are about to walk through was taken seriously at the highest levels of American intellectual life. It shaped a Cold War doctrine. It shaped a novel that every teenager in the English-speaking world is assigned to read. And yet the core idea itself, the thing the book is actually about, has been almost entirely scrubbed from the way we are taught to think about power. You were handed the argument about owners and workers, the argument that was already obsolete when your grandparents were young, and you were never handed the argument that replaced it. That is not an accident of curriculum. As we will see, it is closer to a structural necessity. The new ruling class is difficult to name for reasons that are baked into what it is, and a class that cannot be named is a class that cannot be opposed. To see what Burnham saw, start with the most ordinary thing in the world. A large company. Pick any one of them. A company with a famous name, the kind whose logo you have seen 10,000 times. Now ask a simple question. Who owns it? The honest answer is that it is owned by its shareholders, which in practice means it is owned by hundreds of thousands or millions of strangers. Pension funds holding shares on behalf of retired school teachers. Index funds holding shares on behalf of anyone with a retirement account. Individual investors scattered across dozens of countries who have never set foot in a single one of the company's buildings and never will. That is the ownership. Now ask the second question. Who actually runs it? Who decides what it makes? Who it hires? Where it builds? What it becomes? And the answer is a completely different set of people. A chief executive who in most cases owns a tiny sliver of the company at most. A layer of vice presidents and division heads. Below them a dense web of managers, directors, engineers, analysts, coordinators, compliance officers, and administrators, none of whom own the enterprise in any meaningful sense, all of whom, collectively, control it entirely. The owners cannot run the company. There are too many of them, they are too dispersed, and they do not have the knowledge. The people who can run the company do not own it. And here is the part that matters. The people who run it do not need to own it in order to enjoy almost everything ownership was supposed to provide. The salaries, the status, the authority, the private jets, the power over other people's lives. They have all of it. They just do not hold the title deed. And because they do not hold the title deed, when you go looking for the powerful, you look straight past them. Because you were taught that power lives in ownership, and their power lives somewhere else. This was not Burnham's discovery, and he never claimed it was. 9 years before his book, in 1932, two scholars named Adolf Berle and Berle and Means published a study called The Modern Corporation and Private Property, and they documented this split with data. They went through the largest corporations in the United States and showed, company by company, that ownership had become so scattered among so many shareholders that the actual owners had lost the ability to control the thing they owned. Control had passed to management. Berle and Means called it the separation of ownership and control, and they treated it as a quiet crisis inside American capitalism, a hollowing out of the whole idea of private property from the inside. Burnham read that, and he did something that turned a piece of corporate economics into a theory of the entire modern world. He said, in effect, this is not a quirk of the corporation, this is the shape of the future, and it is happening everywhere at once. If ownership and control have come apart inside the company, they are coming apart inside the state as well. The government is becoming an enormous corporation, and it will be run the same way the corporation is run, not by the people who nominally own it, meaning the citizens, and not by the people who nominally direct it, meaning the elected politicians, but by the permanent administrative apparatus underneath them. The bureau chiefs, the agency heads, the planners, the regulators, the technical experts, the people who write the rules and run the departments and outlast every election. The managers. This is the word that does all the work in Burnham's argument, and it is worth being precise about who he meant, because it is broader than it sounds. When Burnham says managers, he does not simply mean the man with manager on his business card. He means the whole class of people whose function is to direct, coordinate, and administer the technical machinery of modern life. The production managers and the administrative engineers inside industry. The bureau chiefs and agency administrators inside government. The people who possess the specialized knowledge and occupy the coordinating positions without which a complex society simply stops functioning. They are not the owners above them, who hold legal title but have lost operational control. And they are not the workers below them, who carry out tasks but do not direct them. They are the layer in between that has quietly become the layer in charge, because in a sufficiently complex society, whoever controls the process controls the outcome, and ownership becomes a ceremonial relic. Now hold that definition, because Burnham used it to make a prediction so large that it is easy to miss how radical it was. For a century, the entire argument about the future of the modern world had been framed as a contest between two options. Option 1, capitalism continues and the owners keep ruling. Option 2, capitalism collapses and is replaced by socialism, in which the workers finally rule. Karl Marx had built his entire system on the certainty that option 2 was coming. Capitalism would generate its own gravediggers, the working class would seize the means of production, and history would end in a workers' state. Everyone was arguing about which of the two options would win. Burnham said both sides were wrong, and that they were wrong in the same way. There was a third option, and it was already happening, and almost nobody had a name for it. Capitalism was indeed ending. The rule of the owners was indeed finished. But socialism, in the sense Marx meant it, the rule of the working class, was never going to arrive, because the working class does not have what it takes to run a modern society, and never did. The knowledge, the coordinating positions, the technical control, all of it sits with the managers. and so when the owners fell, power would not drop down to the workers. It would stop one level up from them in the hands of the administrators. What was coming would wear the language of the workers and answer to the managers, and it would abolish the old private property of the owners without giving anything real to the workers, because the point was never to free the workers. The point was to transfer control to the people who actually run things. Then, Burnham did the thing that made the book explode, and also the thing that made it dangerous, and also, honestly, the thing that got so much of it wrong. He looked around at the world of 1940 and he said, "You want to see the manager's state? It is already here. It is in front of you in 3 different costumes, and you are refusing to notice that they are the same body underneath." The Soviet Union under Stalin was not a workers' paradise, and was not going to become one. It was the purest managerial state on the planet, a society where private ownership had been abolished entirely and total control had passed to a bureaucratic administrative class that personally owned almost nothing and collectively controlled absolutely everything. Nazi Germany was the same transition in a different key. The state seizing command of the economy and running it through a vast administrative and technical apparatus. And, most provocatively of all, the New Deal in the United States was the early, partial, still democratic version of the very same process, the beginnings of the same managerial machinery being assembled inside a country that still thought of itself as the homeland of free enterprise. Burnham called that last one primitive managerialism, the same organism in an earlier stage of growth. That is a genuinely disturbing thing to write in 1941, and we should sit with why. Burnham was saying that the war everyone was fighting and dying in, the war framed as freedom against tyranny, capitalism against communism, democracy against fascism, was in a deeper sense a family quarrel between 3 versions of the same emerging system. He insisted he was not endorsing any of it. He said he was only describing what he saw, coldly, the way a doctor describes a disease he cannot cure, and that pose of pure clinical detachment is exactly what a lot of readers could not stand, because there was something in the writing, a certain cool relish. That made it sound less like a warning and more like a man admiring the machinery of the thing that was going to crush everyone he was writing for. We are going to come back to that, because the sharpest reader who ever caught that note in Burnham's voice was Orwell, and what Orwell did with it changed literature. But before we get to Orwell, notice what just happened. We asked who is in charge, and Burnham handed us an answer. The managers. The administrators. The people who control without owning. And for a moment that feels like a resolution, like we have named the ruling class and the case is closed, it is not closed. It is barely open. Because naming the managers immediately produces a stranger and worse question. One that is going to pull us all the way down. If the managers took over decades ago, if the rule of the owners really is finished, then why does every single one of us, left and right, rich and poor, still talk and think and vote as though the old map were true? Why is the whole public argument still owners against workers, billionaires against everyone else, when the people who actually run the country are neither? Who benefits from keeping the obsolete map on the wall? And what does it do to a society when its entire political imagination is pointed at a target that stopped being the centre of power 2 generations ago? To answer that, you have to understand where Burnham got the second half of his theory, and that means understanding who Burnham actually was, because the strangest thing about the man who told us the ruling class is invisible is that he spent his own life moving through the ruling class, all the way across it, from one end to the other. He was born in Chicago in 1905, the son of an English immigrant who had climbed to a vice presidency at a major railroad. Real wealth, the kind that buys the best of everything. He was raised Roman Catholic, sent to a Catholic boarding school, and then he walked into Princeton and quietly lost his faith, and became, for the rest of his life, an atheist. He graduated first in his class in 1927. He went to Balliol College at Oxford, where one of his tutors was a young philologist named J. R. Tolkien, who had not yet written a word about hobbits. He came home and joined the philosophy department at New York University at the age of 24, and he would teach there for more than 20 years, eventually chairing the department. This is a man born and bred at the very top of the credentialed world, the world of elite schools and professorships and serious ideas. And then the Depression hit, and like a great many brilliant young people of his generation, Burnham moved hard to the left. Under the influence of a colleague, the philosopher Sidney Hook, he became a Marxist, and not a gentle armchair one. By the middle of the 1930s, he was a committed Trotskyist, a leading figure in an American Revolutionary Party, writing for its theoretical journal, corresponding with Leon Trotsky himself, the exiled architect of the Russian Revolution. For a few years, the Princeton aristocrat was a genuine revolutionary, working to bring down the very capitalist order his family had prospered in. Think about that combination for a moment, because it is going to matter. This was a man who could stand at the top of the owning world and the top of the revolutionary world and feel, in both, like an insider. He knew the ruling class from the inside because he kept joining different versions of it. The thing that broke him out of Marxism is the same thing that gave him his theory, and it happened fast, between 1939 and 1940. Stalin signed a pact with Hitler. The Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east, then invaded Finland, and inside the Trotskyist movement a brutal argument erupted over a single question. Was the Soviet Union still, in any sense, a workers' state that revolutionaries were obligated to defend? Trotsky said yes, it was a degenerated workers' state, deformed but still fundamentally the property of the working class, and it had to be defended against the capitalist world, no matter how monstrous Stalin became. Burnham said no. He looked at the Soviet Union, and he saw something the theory had no box for. He saw a society where the workers owned nothing and controlled nothing, where a new bureaucratic class had total command, where the language of workers' power was pure decoration over the reality of administrators ruling absolutely. What he saw had nothing to do with the workers' state limping toward freedom. It was a new kind of exploiting society, run by a class that had replaced the old owners without ever holding their title. The managers. Trotsky fought him savagely, and the fight went to the root of everything. Trotsky argued that Burnham's real problem was philosophical, that he had abandoned dialectical materialism, the Marxist theory of how reality itself changes, and that without it, Burnham could no longer think straight about history. In one of the documents from that struggle, Trotsky wrote a line that has outlived almost everything else in the quarrel. Burnham, he said, does not recognize the dialectic, but the dialectic recognizes Burnham. It was meant as a warning that reality would have its revenge on a man who thought he could dispense with the deep laws of Marxist theory. Burnham's answer was to walk out. In May of 1940, he wrote a resignation letter, breaking not just with Trotsky, but with Marxism entirely. And he did not hedge. He wrote that he rejected dialectical materialism, that the whole Marxian theory of history seemed to him disproved by the actual evidence, and that Marxian economics struck him as for the most part false or obsolete, or simply meaningless, when applied to the real economy in front of him. He was 34 years old, and he had just torn up the framework that had organised his entire adult intellectual life. The Managerial Revolution came out the next year. It was the sound of a man rebuilding his whole understanding of power from scratch, in public, at speed. But losing Marxism did not turn Burnham into an optimist about democracy. It turned him into something colder, and I think more interesting. 2 years after the Managerial Revolution, he published a second book that is in some ways the deeper one, and almost nobody reads it now. It is called The Machiavellians, and its subtitle is Defenders of Freedom, and it is where Burnham went looking for a theory of power that owed nothing to Marx. He found it in a group of Italian thinkers most educated people have never heard of, and the fact that you have probably never heard of them either is itself part of this story. The first was Gaetano Mosca, who argued something that sounds obvious the moment you hear it, and yet is almost never said plainly. In every society, at every time, in every place, whatever the official system is called, rule is exercised by an organised minority over a disorganised majority. Always, there has never been a real exception. 100 organised men, Mosca said, will defeat 1,000 disorganised ones every time, and the 1,000 can never get organised enough to rule directly, so they are always ruled by some minority or other. Mosca called this the ruling class, or the political class, and he added the piece that turns this from a grumble into a genuine theory. Every ruling class, he said, justifies itself with what he called a political formula, a story, a myth about why this particular minority deserves to be on top. The divine right of kings, the mandate of heaven, the will of the people. The formula does not have to be true. It has to be believed, because a ruling class that has to hold power by naked force alone is unstable, but a ruling class whose subjects believe in the formula rules almost effortlessly. The second was Vilfredo Pareto, who studied how ruling classes rise and fall and gave us the phrase the circulation of elites. Old elites grow soft and complacent and are replaced by hungrier new ones, over and over, so that history is not a march toward freedom, but a slow rotation of one minority out and another minority in. The masses never actually take power. They just change masters and are told it is progress. The third, and the most quietly devastating, was Robert Michels, who studied the political parties of his own day, including the socialist parties that were explicitly, sincerely committed to democracy and equality and worker control. And Michels found that even those parties, the ones founded specifically to abolish rule by elites, developed their own entrenched ruling minorities as soon as they grew large enough to need full-time organisers and officials. He called it the iron law of oligarchy. Any organisation, no matter how democratic its intentions, tends to develop a small permanent leadership that ends up running it in the leadership's own interest. There is no escape hatch. Scale requires organisation, organisation requires specialists, and specialists become an oligarchy. The very act of building an organisation to fight elite rule generates a new elite. Put those three together, and you have the framework Burnham used to complete his theory, and you can feel the trap closing. Every society is ruled by a minority. Every ruling minority hides behind a formula, a legitimating myth. And every attempt to abolish minority rule just produces a new minority. Now apply that to the managers. The managerial class is the new organised minority. It took over because complexity handed it the coordinating positions that constitute real control. And, like every ruling class before it, it needs a formula, a story about why its rule is legitimate and should not be questioned. What, then, is the managerial formula? What is the myth that keeps the new ruling class comfortably in power and keeps you from looking directly at it? Here is where it gets genuinely uncomfortable, because the answer is the thing you were raised to revere. The formula of the managerial class is the language of democracy, expertise, and neutrality. The managerial class does not rule in its own name the way a king ruled in his. It rules in your name. It governs on behalf of the people, in the public interest, according to the best available evidence, guided by expertise, in service of fairness and inclusion and the common good. It does not say I command, it says I administer. It does not say obey me. It says this is simply how the process works. And that formula is almost perfectly designed to be invisible, because a ruling class that claims to be merely serving cannot easily be seen to be ruling. Democracy, in this view, is not the name for who rules. It is the name for the story the rulers tell about why you should not ask. The old owners versus workers map gets to stay up on the wall for exactly the same reason. As long as your anger is aimed at the billionaires, at the owners, at a ruling class that lost operational control decades ago. It is not aimed at the people who actually run things. The decoy is doing its job. And notice who was supposed to warn you about all this, and did not. Mosca, Pareto, Michels, the elite theorists, the people who built an entire rigorous framework for asking the one question that matters, which is who actually rules, have been pushed so far to the margins of respectable thought that you can complete an entire education, including a degree in political science, and barely encounter them. The discipline whose whole job is the study of power mostly declines to ask the question in these terms, because the answer is impolite, and because, as we are about to see, the people who study power are themselves members of the class the question is about. But the man who did ask it, and who wrote a novel that put the answer into the head of nearly everyone who can read English, was not a political scientist at all. He was a dying, disillusioned English socialist who read Burnham, decided Burnham was half brilliant and half monstrous, and went to war with him on the page. George Orwell reviewed the managerial revolution more than once, and you can watch him wrestling with it across several years, because he could not put it down and he could not accept it. He thought Burnham had seen something real, and then poisoned it with the way he saw it. In 1945, in a newspaper column, Orwell described the world as splitting into the 2 or 3 huge superstates forecast in Burnham's book, and if that phrase gives you a chill, it should, because 4 years later, Orwell published 1984, and the entire geography of that novel is Burnham's map turned into fiction. 3 vast superstates, Oceania and Eurasia and Eastasia, locked in a permanent, unwinnable and largely fake war, each one internally organised as a rigid hierarchy with a small inner party of administrators at the top, a larger outer party of functionaries in the middle, and the great mass of proles at the bottom, who are kept comfortable enough to be harmless. That is not a fantasy Orwell pulled from nowhere. That is Burnham's managerial society, dramatised. The inner party is the managerial elite. The perpetual war is Burnham's prediction of superstates in permanent stalemate. Orwell took the thing that most frightened him in Burnham and built a cage out of it so that the rest of us could feel what it would be like to live inside. But here is what makes Orwell essential to this story, rather than just a famous name attached to it. He borrowed Burnham's diagnosis, and then he turned around and took Burnham's forecasting apart with a precision that has never really been improved on. In a long essay in 1946 called Second Thoughts on James Burnham, Orwell made an observation that I think you need in order to hold the rest of this in your head honestly. He pointed out that Burnham had a habit. Whatever was winning at the moment Burnham sat down to write, that was the thing Burnham predicted would go on to dominate the world. When Germany was sweeping across Europe, Burnham wrote as though German victory was essentially settled and the future belonged to a Nazi-led managerial Europe. When Germany began to lose and the Soviet Union began to advance, Burnham revised, and now the future belonged to a Soviet-led managerial order sweeping westward. Orwell caught the pattern and named the disease. Burnham, he wrote, worshipped power, and specifically he worshipped whatever power looked strongest at the moment of writing, and this, Orwell said, was a common and dangerous mental habit, rooted partly in simple cowardice, the instinct to be on the winning side and to mistake momentum for destiny. And then Orwell wrote the line about Burnham that I cannot stop thinking about, because it turns out to be the key to everything that happens later in this story, including things Orwell never lived to see. It is curious, Orwell wrote, that in all his talk about the struggle for power, Burnham never stops to ask why people want power. Sit with that. Here is a man who has written the coldest, clearest analysis of power in a generation, who can tell you exactly how power moves and who holds it and how they disguise it, and he has somehow never paused to ask the most human question of all, which is what the wanting of power actually is, what it does to a person, why anyone reaches for it in the first place. Orwell's suspicion was that Burnham could not ask that question, because Burnham was, in a quiet way, infected with the very thing he was describing, You cannot stare that long and that admiringly into the machinery of domination without some of it getting into you. Remember that, because it is going to come back with a vengeance, and not only for Burnham. Because look at what Burnham actually did next, and ask yourself whether Orwell had his number. While he was writing about the coming rule of the administrators, Burnham went and became one. During the war, he left the university and went to work for the Office of Strategic Services, the American Wartime Intelligence Agency, and the direct ancestor of the Central Intelligence Agency, where he worked in the division concerned with psychological warfare, which is to say the scientific management of what foreign populations believe. When the war ended and the agency was reborn as the CIA, he consulted for the arm of it responsible for covert political operations, the semi-secret office that ran propaganda, funded friendly publications, and quietly shaped the intellectual life of post-war Europe. On behalf of the United States, read that sentence again with the theory in mind. The man who had just explained to the world that the future belonged to a class ruling through the administration of technical processes took a job administering the technical process of mass persuasion. He was not observing the managerial revolution at that point. He was staffing it. And then he wrote the books that made him a Cold War strategist rather than a social theorist. The Struggle for the World in 1947, arguing that the war against the Soviet Union had already begun and the United States needed to accept it. The Coming Defeat of Communism in 1949. Containment or Liberation in 1953, which argued that simply containing Soviet power was a losing posture and that the United States should be actively working to roll it back. That last idea, liberation rather than containment, worked its way through decades of American strategic thinking and surfaced again, decades later, in the doctrine of the administration that would eventually hang a medal around his neck. In 1955 he helped found National Review, and for more than 20 years he wrote a column in it called The Third World War, treating the Cold War as a single continuous conflict that had been running since before most of his readers noticed it had started. William F. Buckley Jr., who ran the magazine, later described Burnham as the dominant intellectual influence on it. The former Trotskyist had become the strategic brain of American conservatism. Watch the arc of that life as a single shape. Revolutionary, professor, intelligence officer, propagandist, strategist, editor, presidential advisor at one remove. At no point does he step outside the apparatus of organised, credentialed, professional power. He simply moves between its rooms, and each room is closer to the centre than the last. Orwell said the man had a habit of siding with whatever power looked strongest. What Orwell may not have fully anticipated is how completely that habit would be rewarded, and how natural the rewards would look. Nobody had to buy Burnham. Nobody had to threaten him. The system simply offered him progressively more interesting work at progressively higher altitude, and he took it, the way any of us would have taken it, and by the end there was no daylight left between the diagnostician and the disease. He had a stroke in 1978 that damaged his memory, and it effectively ended his writing life. The man who had built his entire career on holding the whole structure of world power in his head lost the ability to hold much of anything in it. He stopped contributing to the magazine he had helped create. 5 years later, still frail, he stood in the East Room and accepted the medal. He lived 4 more years after that and died in 1987 at the age of 81 in Connecticut. And the framework he had built, the one that explains more about how you are actually governed than anything you were taught in school, went into the ground with a strange and quiet completeness, remembered mostly as a curiosity, a footnote to Orwell, a book that used to be famous. There is an irony in that ending sharp enough to cut yourself on. Burnham's entire theory was that the individual no longer matters much, that power has migrated into structures and processes that grind on regardless of who occupies them. And the thing that finally silenced him was not an enemy or a scandal or a refutation. It was a small biological accident in the tissue of the one organ his whole authority rested on. After which the structures went on exactly as before, without him, exactly as his theory said they would. Now I have to stop and correct something, because if I do not, you will walk away from this with the wrong idea, and the wrong idea is the one that fills the comment sections and the podcasts. A lot of people who invoke Burnham today talk about him as a prophet, a man who saw the future with uncanny clarity while everyone else was blind. That is not true, and pretending it is true actually makes his real achievement smaller, not bigger. Burnham was, on the specifics, a genuinely bad forecaster. Let me just lay out the scorecard, because the audience for this deserves the honest version. He wrote in 1940 as though a German victory was the overwhelmingly likely outcome of the war. Wrong. He predicted that Germany would not turn and attack the Soviet Union until after Britain had already been beaten. Wrong, and almost immediately wrong, because Hitler invaded the Soviet Union the very next year, with Britain still standing. He predicted that the Soviet Union might well crack apart under the strain. Wrong for another half a century. And the centerpiece prediction, the three co-equal superstates dividing the world between them, never happened either. The war did not produce three managerial superstates in balance. It produced two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, in a bipolar standoff, which is not the same picture at all. If you are keeping score on predictions, Burnham loses badly. Therefore, the real question, the interesting question, is why the book refuses to die. Why do serious people keep dragging it back out, decade after decade, if the man got the actual forecasts so consistently wrong? And the answer is the thing that should make the hair on your arms stand up. The predictions were the surface. They were the part of the book bound to the headlines of 1940, and the headlines changed, so the predictions rotted. But underneath the predictions was a structural diagnosis, a claim about the deep shape of modern power, and that diagnosis did not rot. It came true, slowly, in ways Burnham himself got the details wrong about, over a span of decades. In every advanced country on Earth, regardless of whether it was capitalist or communist, democratic or authoritarian, ownership and control came apart, exactly as he said. An administrative class took operational command of both the corporation and the state, exactly as he said, and that class learned to rule while claiming only to serve, exactly as he said. Orwell, for all his contempt for Burnham's power worship, conceded the central point. He said the description of where power was actually going was extremely plausible, and that the Soviet Union was clearly neither a workers' democracy nor a country sliding back toward ordinary capitalism, but some third thing that the old categories could not hold. Orwell just refused to admire it. Think about how strange this is as an intellectual event. A man makes a batch of confident predictions, and almost all of them fail, and yet the framework underneath the failed predictions turns out to be one of the most durable descriptions of modern power ever written, so durable that 80 years later, people across the entire political spectrum are still reaching for it to explain their own moment. The forecasts were noise, the structure was signal, and the structure is not a museum piece. It is bigger now than it was when he described it, larger and denser and more deeply woven into your daily life than Burnham in 1940 could have imagined, and we are going to measure exactly how much larger, because the growth is documented and the numbers are almost comic. But before we go there, I want to plant something, because it is going to matter more than any statistic. Orwell's charge against Burnham was not really that Burnham was wrong about the facts. It was that Burnham had caught something from the material, that the act of looking at raw power for long enough, coldly enough, admiringly enough, does something to the person doing the looking. It pulls them toward the thing they are studying. Burnham started as a revolutionary trying to free the working class, and ended as a man who wrote about the coming rule of the administrators with a detachment that read, to Orwell, almost like approval, and then spent the back half of his life as a cold-eyed strategist of American power, advising presidents on how to win. The framework he built to expose the ruling class seemed to keep pulling him deeper into it. And if that can happen to the man who invented the framework, you should be asking what it might do to the next person who picks it up and refuses to let go. There was going to be a next person. He was going to take Burnham's idea further and harder than Burnham ever did, and the framework was going to do to him something far worse than it ever did to Burnham. Keep him in the back of your mind, we are not ready for him yet. The managerial revolution did not stop at the edge of the corporation. That was Burnham's real point, and it is the thing you can now watch unfolding in slow motion across your entire lifetime. Once ownership and control came apart, once it became normal for the people who run an institution to be a separate class from the people who nominally own or elect it, that pattern spread into everything. The government, the universities, the hospitals, the foundations, the media companies, the non-profits, the banks. Every large institution in a modern society is now run the same way, by a professional administrative layer that controls the operation without owning it and without being elected to it, and that layer has quietly become the single most powerful class in the country, precisely because it is the one class that sits inside all of those institutions at once. Start with the government, because the numbers there are not a matter of interpretation. When people say the administrative state, this is what they mean. The laws that Congress passes, the ones you can name, the ones that get voted on and argued about on television, are a thin surface. Underneath them sits a vast body of actual binding rules, regulations written not by elected representatives, but by the permanent agencies, the administrators. The exact managerial layer Burnham described, and you can measure how much of it there is, because it is printed. The Code of Federal Regulations is the collected body of federal rules in the United States. In 1960 it ran to about 22,800 pages. By the end of 2021 it had grown to more than 188,000 pages. Call that what it is, roughly an 8-fold increase in the volume of binding rules, written overwhelmingly by people you did not elect and cannot vote out, governing almost every aspect of how you work, what you build, what you consume, and what you are allowed to do with your own property. The elected part of the government, the part the old civics textbook told you about, has become a kind of ceremonial front porch on a building whose actual rooms are run by administrators whose names you will never learn. I want to be fair here, because this is exactly the point where this kind of argument usually goes stupid, and I do not want to do that to you. A great deal of that regulation exists for reasons you would probably endorse. It keeps things out of your food that would hurt you. It keeps the bridge you drove over this morning from falling into the river. The administrative state is not a cartoon villain, and the people inside it are, for the most part, sincere professionals doing genuinely necessary work. That is not the point. The point is about where power actually sits. The point is that the machinery that governs your daily life has, over the course of a century, migrated almost entirely into the hands of a class that is neither elected nor owned, and that this migration was never voted on, never announced, never presented to you as a choice. It simply happened, the way a tide comes in, one necessary sounding decision at a time. Until one day you looked up and the ocean was where the beach used to be. It helps to walk through how one of those rules actually comes into existence, because the process is public, entirely legal, and almost nobody has ever looked at it. Congress passes a law. The law is usually broad, because broad laws are easier to get majorities for, and because the people voting on it often do not have the technical knowledge to write the specifics. The law says something like, "The agency shall establish standards adequate to protect the public health." That sentence is the entire democratic content of what follows. From there, the matter passes to the agency, where career specialists draft the actual rule, the one with the numbers in it, the one that determines what you may build and how and at what cost. The proposed rule is published, and the public is invited to comment. Anyone may comment. In practice, the comments that arrive are overwhelmingly from organised parties with professional staffs, because reading a technical rule and drafting a substantive objection to it takes expertise and paid hours that ordinary people do not have. The agency reviews the comments, responds to them, and issues the final rule, which now has the force of law over you. It was written by people you did not elect, refined in a conversation conducted almost entirely between credentialed professionals, and it will still be binding 20 years from now when everyone who touched it has moved on. Notice that nothing in that sequence is corrupt. Nobody broke a law. Nobody took a bribe. Every step is exactly what the textbook says it is. The system worked, and at the end of the process, a binding rule governing your life exists. And if you go looking for the human being who decided it, you will find that there is not one. There is a chain of reasonable people, each of whom did their part correctly, and none of whom, individually, made the decision. Nothing in that sequence is a malfunction. The machine is doing precisely what it was built to do. Responsibility is not concealed, it is dissolved, distributed so thinly across so many competent professionals that no single one of them is holding enough of it to be accountable for the result. Multiply that by the page count and you can feel the size of it. More than 188,000 pages of rules produced this way. If a page holds something like 300 words, that is on the order of 56 million words of binding law. Reading at a normal pace, 40 hours a week, doing nothing else, taking no holidays, it would take you close to 2 years to read the rules you are currently required to obey, once, without stopping to understand any of them. Nobody has read them. Nobody could. The volume of law governing your life exceeded the capacity of any individual human being to know it sometime in the middle of the last century, and it has kept growing every year since. Which means that compliance is no longer something a citizen can achieve through diligence. It is something a citizen achieves by hiring a professional, or by being lucky. And the requirement to hire professionals in order to remain lawful is itself one of the largest transfers of power to the credentialed class that has ever occurred. And none of this would have surprised the man who saw the whole thing coming 40 years before Burnham did, and who is, for my money, the most important figure in this entire story that nobody thinks to mention. Max Weber was a German sociologist, born in 1864, dead of pneumonia in 1920 at the age of 56, and in the enormous unfinished work published after his death, he laid out an analysis of bureaucracy that has never been improved on. Weber's starting point was not moral. He was not writing a complaint. He argued that bureaucratic administration is genuinely superior to every other way of organizing collective human effort, and he meant that as a technical claim. He compared the fully developed bureaucratic mechanism to other forms of organization the way a machine compares to non-mechanical methods of production. Precision, speed, consistency, continuity across the lifetimes of individuals. The application of expert knowledge rather than the whims of a personal ruler. Weber's point was that bureaucracy wins, everywhere, against every rival, not through conspiracy or force, but because it is simply better at the job, and any society that refuses it will be outcompeted by societies that accept it. This is why the managerial class could take over the Soviet Union and the United States, and everywhere in between. No ideology won that contest. A technology did. And then Weber followed his own argument to the place that terrified him. If bureaucratic administration is technically superior, then it will keep spreading, and it will keep spreading regardless of what anyone wants, and it cannot be reversed, because reversing it means accepting worse outcomes than your neighbours, which no society will do for long. He wrote that once fully established, bureaucracy is among those social structures which are hardest to destroy, not one of the hardest to overthrow, note, to destroy. He understood that you can decapitate the leadership of a bureaucracy as often as you like, and the apparatus itself will keep functioning. Because the apparatus is not the people in it, and a conquering army that seizes a country generally finds it, needs the existing administration to keep the country running, and so leaves it in place with new nameplates on the doors. Weber had an image for where this ends that has become one of the most famous phrases in the history of social thought. though most people who use it have no idea what he meant. He wrote that the modern economic order had become an immensely powerful cosmos into which the individual is born, and which presents itself, at least as an individual, as an unalterable housing. English translation gave us the phrase the iron cage, which is not quite literal. The German is closer to a shell as hard as steel, but the meaning survives. He was not talking about oppression in the ordinary sense. He was talking about a structure so total and so rational that there is no vantage point left outside it from which to want something else. And in the closing pages of that same book, he wondered what kind of human being such a world would produce, and gave an answer so cold that people have been arguing about it for a century. Specialists without spirit, he wrote. Sensualists without heart. And this nullity, he added, imagines that it has attained a level of civilization never before achieved. That was written before the First World War, before Burnham was born, before the New Deal, before the Soviet Union existed, before a single one of the agencies we have been discussing was created. Weber looked at the machinery of administration in Imperial Germany and correctly predicted the entire shape of the century that followed, including the part where the machinery would outlive every ideology that tried to ride it. And the question he ended on is the one this whole story keeps circling. Weber asked what could be set against this machinery in order to keep some portion of humanity free from it. He did not have an answer. He was one of the most rigorous minds of his age. He saw the problem with total clarity 100 years ago, and he could not think of a single thing that would work. And here is the move that makes the managerial class almost impossible to attack. The move that is worth understanding better than any other single thing in this whole story. The power of a manager does not come from owning anything, and does not come from being chosen by anyone. It comes from credentials, from process, and from expertise. The manager rules because he or she is certified to rule, has the degree, knows the procedure, holds the qualification, speaks the specialized language, occupies the coordinating seat. And that form of power has a magic property that ownership never had. It presents itself as neutral. The owner rules in his own naked self-interest and everyone can see it. The manager rules on behalf of competence itself, on behalf of best practices, on behalf of the evidence, on behalf of fairness. And so the manager's rule does not look like rule at all. It looks like administration. It looks like just following the process. It looks like the way things are simply done by serious people. Try to fight it and you are not fighting a person or a class. You are fighting expertise. You are fighting the process. You are, they will gently inform you, fighting reality itself. And who are you exactly to do that? What are your qualifications? That is the formula Mosca warned you about, upgraded for the modern world, and it is far stronger than the divine right of kings ever was. Because you can behead a king, and you cannot behead a process. And once you see it, you start to notice that the managerial class behaves less like a group of individuals, and more like a single organism with its own drives. It grows. It always grows. Every problem, whatever its origin, calls for more administration, more coordination, more oversight, more process, more managers. It absorbs. When something outside it threatens it, an insurgency, a protest, a rival source of authority, its instinct is not to crush that thing, but to manage it, to bring it inside, to give it an office and a budget and a set of procedures until it becomes just another department. It does not need you to love it. It does not even need you to believe in it. It needs you to comply with the process, and processes are designed so that compliance is the path of least resistance. The system does not rule by conviction. It rules by making every other option more exhausting than obedience. That is a kind of power that no ancient tyrant ever dreamed of, because it does not require your agreement. It only requires your fatigue. Now, if this were only a theory dreamed up by one disillusioned ex-Marxist and carried on by a handful of conservatives, you would be right to be suspicious of it, to wonder whether it is just a fancy way of dressing up an ordinary political grievance. And here is what stopped me cold when I first came across it. The fact that convinced me there was something real underneath all this, and not just clever rhetoric. The exact same class was discovered independently, at almost the same level of detail, from the opposite end of the political spectrum, by people who despised everything Burnham stood for. In 1977, two writers named Barbara and John Ehrenreich, a married couple, both firmly on the radical left, published a long essay trying to answer a question that was haunting the American left at the time. Why had the movements of the 1960s failed? Why had the New Left, so full of energy and idealism, never actually connected with the working class it claimed to speak for? And their answer was that the New Left had never really been a working class movement at all. It had been the movement of a distinct social class that Marxist theory had no proper name for, a class of salaried, college-educated professionals who did not own the means of production, but who did not do manual labour either. Teachers, professors, journalists, social workers, engineers, middle managers, doctors, planners, the whole army of credentialed experts whose job, the Ehrenreichs argued, was essentially to manage, coordinate and reproduce the social order on behalf of the system. They gave this class a name. They called it the professional-managerial class. And if that phrase sounds familiar, if you have heard it thrown around as an insult in the last few years, this is where it comes from two Marxists in 1977 trying to understand why their revolution never came. Stop and appreciate what just happened, because it is genuinely rare in the history of ideas. An ex-Trotskyist who became a Cold War conservative, and a pair of committed radical leftists looking at the same society from opposite ends of the political universe, with opposite values and opposite hopes, independently identified the same class as the decisive one. Burnham called them the managers. The Ehrenreichs called them the professional-managerial class. Same people, same power, same detachment from ownership, same rule through credential and expertise, same problem of a group that controls without owning. When your fiercest ideological enemies, working in complete isolation from each other, draw the same map, that map is probably describing something real, and the Ehrenreichs even measured it. By their reckoning, this class had made up less than 1% of American employment as late as 1930, and had grown to something like a third of all jobs by the 2000s. In the span of one long human lifetime, the class that owns nothing and rules everything went from a rounding error to the largest single block in the workforce. And yet, and this is where the abdication becomes almost funny, this enormous decisive class is the one thing the institutions that study society are strangely unable to see clearly. Ask yourself who is supposed to explain power to the public. The universities, the journalists, the political scientists, the serious commentators. Now ask yourself what class every single one of those people belongs to. They are the professional managerial class. They are the credentialed experts. They are, to a person, members of the exact group the question is about. Expecting the managerial class to produce a clear-eyed analysis of the rule of the managerial class is like expecting a fish to produce a clear-eyed analysis of water. The water is not hidden from the fish. It is simply everywhere, and it is what the fish is swimming in, and it is the medium through which the fish sees everything else, which means it is the one thing the fish can never quite bring into focus. That is not a conspiracy. Nobody has to suppress anything. It is something quieter and harder to fight. A blindness built into the position of the observer. We have a better name now than we started with. Not just the managers, but the credentialed professional class, the administrators, the experts, the whole army of people who run every large institution in the society through control of process, rather than ownership of property, unelected, unownable, and convinced, sincerely, that they are not a ruling class at all, but simply the reasonable people making things work. That feels like progress. We have located them. But locating them only sharpens the real problem, the one that has been waiting underneath this whole time. because a class you cannot vote out, cannot buy out, cannot even clearly point to without being told you are a crank. A class that includes the very people whose job is to tell you who rules. A class that grows every time you try to cut it and absorbs every enemy that comes at it. Is a class with no obvious pressure point. No throne to storm, no king to depose, no headquarters to march on. And exactly one man in the last 50 years tried to map that class completely enough to find the place where its enemies could finally stand and fight. He found something in the map that broke him. And what it turned him into is the darkest part of this entire story. His name was Samuel Todd Francis, and to understand why his story matters so much, you have to first understand that he was not an outsider throwing rocks. He was, by background, exactly the kind of person the managerial system produces. Born in Chattanooga, Tennessee in 1947. A degree from Johns Hopkins. A doctorate in history from the University of North Carolina, earned in 1979. And the subject of his early scholarly work, the thing he built his intellectual life on, was James Burnham. His first serious book was a study of Burnham's political thought. He then went to work at the Heritage Foundation, one of the most influential policy institutes in Washington, and after that as a national security aide to a United States senator. And then as a columnist at the Washington Times, where he was good enough at the craft to win a national award for distinguished editorial writing 2 years running at the end of the 1980s. This is a credentialed, awarded, establishment-trained intellectual, a member in good standing of the very professional class we have been describing. Hold that, because the irony is about to become unbearable. Francis took Burnham's idea and did what Burnham never quite did. He built it out into a complete, rigorous, almost architectural theory of how a soft managerial regime actually holds power, and in doing so he answered a question that had been nagging at the whole framework. If the managerial class rules 3 different kinds of society, the Soviet, the fascist, and the liberal democratic, then why do they look so different from the inside? Why does one rule with secret police and gulags, while another rules with elections and shopping malls? Francis's answer was that there are 2 modes of managerial rule, and understanding the difference is the key to understanding your own life. There is the hard managerial regime, the Soviet and fascist version, which rules through force, terror, and open command, because it is trying to smash and rebuild an old order quickly. And there is the soft managerial regime, the version you actually live under, which does not need force because it has something far more effective. It rules through manipulation, through therapy, through marketing, through mass media, consumer comfort, education, entertainment, and the endless reshaping of what people want and how they understand themselves. The hard regime breaks you. The soft regime manages you so thoroughly that it never has to break you, because you have been shaped from childhood to want what the system needs you to want. In the book where he laid this out, a massive work called Leviathan and Its Enemies, that he finished in the mid-1990s and that was only published years after his death, Francis put the point in a way that should genuinely unsettle anyone who takes democracy as the answer to the question of who rules. The formal mechanisms of mass democracy, he wrote, the elections, the parties, the universal right to vote, the legal and political rights, do not significantly reduce the monolithic and uniform concentration of managerial power. Read that slowly. He is not saying elections are rigged in the crude sense. He is saying something worse. He is saying that elections are real, and that they do not matter to the thing that actually holds power. Because the thing that holds power is not on the ballot, and never was. You can vote for either party. The managerial class staffs the agencies, the courts, the universities, the media, and the corporations, regardless of which party wins, and it continues administering the country according to its own logic, no matter who you elect. Because the elected officials come and go every few years, while the managerial apparatus is permanent. The vote is real. It is just aimed at the front porch, and the house is run from the rooms behind it. Francis had another concept, and this one has quietly escaped into the language, even though most of the people using it have no idea where it came from. He called it anarcho-tyranny. It is his word for a specific and maddening condition, a state that is simultaneously too weak and too strong, that fails at the basic job of governing while excelling at the intrusive job of controlling. On one side, anarchy, the state seems unable or unwilling to enforce the law against actual disorder, against real criminals, against the things that genuinely threaten ordinary people's safety and lives. On the other side, at the very same time tyranny, the state is relentlessly efficient at regulating, monitoring, taxing, licensing, and criminalizing the law-abiding, the ordinary, the people who were never the problem. Francis called it a kind of synthesis of anarchy and tyranny, the two supposedly opposite conditions fused into one, and his explanation for why it happens is pure managerial theory. A managerial regime is not actually organized to protect its citizens, it is organized to manage them, to expand its own reach and process and control. Chasing real criminals is hard, dangerous, and politically messy. Regulating the compliant middle is easy, safe, and endlessly expandable. And so the system drifts, always, toward doing the second thing while failing at the first, not because anyone designed it that way, but because that is the path of least resistance for a machine whose real purpose is its own growth. Once you have that phrase in your head, anarcho-tyranny, you will see it everywhere, and you will not be able to stop. There is a further piece of Francis's analysis that deserves more attention than it gets, because it explains something about modern life that almost everyone notices and almost nobody can account for. Francis argued that a managerial regime does not merely administer the population, it requires a particular kind of population in order to function, and it therefore sets about producing one. The reasoning is uncomfortably tight. A managerial apparatus governs through uniform, general, centrally administered procedures. Anything local, particular, inherited, or self-organizing is an obstacle to that, because it cannot be processed uniformly. A tight neighborhood that solves its own problems does not need the agency. A strong extended family absorbs the shocks that would otherwise require an intervention. A church, a guild, a union hall, a fraternal lodge, a town that handles its own affairs, all of these are competing sources of authority and support, and every one of them is friction in the machine. Francis's claim was that the managerial regime does not attack these institutions out of malice. It dissolves them the way water dissolves salt, simply by being present, because it can perform their functions more uniformly and more efficiently, and because every function it absorbs is another dependency created and another rival authority weakened. The end state is a population of isolated individuals in direct, unmediated contact with large institutions, which is precisely the population that is easiest to administer, and which also happens to be the loneliest arrangement human beings have ever lived in. Whatever you think of the man, hold that against your own experience, and ask how badly it fits. The steady evaporation of the local, the associational, the inherited, the amateur, the transfer of functions once handled by families and neighbours and volunteers into the hands of trained professionals. The way the answer to almost every social problem, from either political party, is now some form of program administered by credentialed staff. Francis said this was the regime reproducing the conditions of its own necessity, and that it would be experienced by the people living through it not as a loss of power but as progress, because each individual transfer really is an improvement in service. The professional really is better at it than your aunt was. That is the whole trap. Every step is an upgrade, and the sum of the upgrades is a society in which nothing can be done without permission, and no one has anyone to call but an institution. He also understood what this does to the language of politics, and this is where his analysis turns genuinely sharp. In a managerial order, Francis argued, the old political vocabulary of interests and power gets replaced by a therapeutic vocabulary of problems and solutions. Conflicts between groups with genuinely different interests get reframed as misunderstandings, as failures of communication, as pathologies to be treated rather than disagreements to be settled. And that reframing is not neutral, because a conflict of interests is something you can win, while a pathology is something you receive treatment for. Convert every political question into a technical or therapeutic one, and you have not resolved the underlying conflict. You have simply moved it out of the arena where the public can fight over it and into the office of the specialist, where the public has no standing and the specialist has all of it. That is one of the most effective techniques of depoliticization ever devised, and the remarkable thing about it is that it is almost always deployed by people who sincerely believe they are being kind. And Francis did one more thing. The thing that makes people on the political right treat him, still, as a kind of buried prophet. He asked where the enemies of the managerial regime could possibly come from, and he thought he had found them. Borrowing a term from a sociologist named Donald Warren, he pointed to a group he called the Middle American Radicals, the great mass of ordinary Middle Americans caught in a viz, squeezed from above by the managerial elite that looked down on them, and from below by a dependent underclass that the elite subsidized and championed against them. These people, Francis argued, were the one force with both the numbers and the grievance to potentially break managerial rule if they ever stopped voting along the old lines and started voting as a bloc against the entire managerial order itself. He was writing this in the early 1990s, and if, reading that description now, you feel a jolt of recognition, if it sounds like it is describing the populist explosions that would tear through American and European politics decades later, you are not the only one who has noticed. A great many commentators across the spectrum have looked back at Francis and concluded that he saw the shape of 21st century populism coming from 30 years away. That is the case his admirers make, and, on the analysis alone, it is not a weak one. Which is exactly why what happened to him matters so much, and why I cannot tell you this story honestly without telling you the rest of it, the part his admirers tend to rush past. Because Samuel Francis did not just theorize about where the enemies of the managerial regime would come from. He went looking for a place to stand and fight, a ground on which the Middle American radicals could be organized into a real force, and the ground he chose was race. Over the course of the 1990s he moved, in public and in print, into open white racial identity politics. In 1994 he spoke at a conference run by an organization dedicated to race science and white racial identity, and he argued there that white Americans needed to reassert themselves in explicitly racial terms. When those remarks were publicized, the Washington Times fired him, and rather than retreat, he went further. He spent the last decade of his life editing the newsletter of a white supremacist organization, and by the time he died of heart failure in 2005, at the age of 57, he was tracked by civil rights organizations as one of the leading white nationalist writers in the country. I am not going to soften that or hide it inside careful language. The man became a racist propagandist. That is the documented record rather than my reading of it, and it is a genuinely ugly one. Now watch what happens here, because this is the exact hinge of the whole story, and it is the place where I need you to think harder than the material usually asks anyone to think. Remember Orwell's charge against Burnham, that staring too long and too coldly into raw power does something to the person doing the staring, pulls them toward the thing they are studying, and that Burnham never asked why people want power because he could not afford to look at what wanting it was doing to him. Francis is that warning, fulfilled, and darkened past anything Orwell imagined. Here was a man who understood, better than almost anyone alive, that the managerial regime rules by absorbing every opposition, by managing and neutralizing and digesting anyone who comes at it, by turning every insurgency into another department. He knew that. He wrote it down. And in his desperate search for one thing the system could not absorb, one loyalty it could not manage away. He reached for blood and race, the most primal and least manageable identity he could find. He thought he had found the regime's blind spot. Instead, he found the thing that neutralized him more completely and more permanently than any managerial technique ever could have. His racism did not wound the managerial order, it destroyed him, and it handed that order the cleanest imaginable reason to sweep his entire framework into the trash along with him. The man who spent his life warning that the system absorbs and discredits all its enemies became, through his own choices, the most easily discredited enemy imaginable. And here is the part that I think is genuinely difficult, the part the managerial formula itself does not want you to be able to do. Both things are true at once. Francis became something contemptible, and some of his analysis of how power works was sharp and, on its own terms, largely correct. Those two facts do not cancel each other. A true description of how power operates does not become false because a bad man wrote it down, and a bad man does not become admirable because he happened to see something clearly. Holding both of those in your head at the same time is uncomfortable, and it is supposed to be, and notice how strong the pull is to resolve the discomfort by collapsing it, to decide that because the man was a racist, the ideas must be worthless, or, from the other direction, that because the ideas are sharp, the man's sins must be exaggerated. That instinct to sort everything cleanly into approved and forbidden, to make the discomfort go away by refusing to think two thoughts at once, is not neutral. It is trained. It is, in fact, one of the deepest reflexes the soft managerial regime installs in you. Because a population that sorts every idea into permitted and impermissible and stops thinking at the boundary is a population that is extraordinarily easy to manage. The regime does not need to ban Burnham and Francis. It only needs you to feel that examining them is somehow disreputable, and to police that feeling in yourself, for free, forever, and that reflex. The trained instinct to sort every idea into approved and forbidden and stop thinking at the line is the thread that pulls us into the next layer. Because it turns out, you are not the only one who has felt the shape of this thing in the dark and reached for a name. Almost everyone has. That is the strange situation we have arrived at. We have named the ruling class about as precisely as it can be named. The managers. The credentialed professionals, the administrative apparatus that runs every large institution through control of process rather than ownership of property, that spans government and corporation and university and media all at once, that grows without limit and absorbs every enemy and rules by making obedience less exhausting than resistance, that is staffed by the very people whose job is to explain power to you. And that hides behind the most beautiful formula any ruling class has ever devised, the claim that it is not ruling at all, but simply serving. We have located it. And the moment you go looking, you discover that half the country has been pointing at the same shape for years, screaming different names at it, and that the names themselves have become a weapon the thing uses to stay invisible. Before we go on, there is a question we have skipped past, and it is the one that turns this from an interesting description into something with teeth. How does a class like this reproduce itself? An aristocracy passes on land and title through blood. A capitalist class passes on capital. But a class whose power lives in credentials and expertise owns nothing it can leave in a will. In theory, that should make it the most open ruling class in history, replaced every generation by whoever happens to be the most capable. That is precisely the claim it makes about itself. Look at what actually happens. The gate is education, and the gate is not free. Access to the credentials that confer managerial standing runs through a sequence of institutions, and admission to those institutions depends overwhelmingly on preparation that begins in early childhood and is supplied, at enormous expense in money and time and attention, by parents who already hold the credentials. The children of the credentialed class arrive at the gate having been trained for it since birth. They know the vocabulary. They know how the process works, because the process is the water their parents swim in. They have the test preparation, the extracurricular record, the essays edited by someone who knows what admissions officers want, the summer positions arranged through a parent's professional network. The children of everyone else arrive at the same gate having been told, accurately, that it is open to anyone. The class does turn out to be hereditary, in practice, to a degree that is not much different from an aristocracy. But here is the part that makes it far more durable than an aristocracy ever was. The old aristocrat knew he had inherited his position. He might defend it, he might feel entitled to it, but he did not generally pretend he had earned it, and neither did anyone else. Which meant the arrangement could be named, resented, argued about, and eventually dismantled. The credentialed class believes, sincerely and in most cases correctly at the level of individual effort, that it earned everything it has. It worked hard, it passed the exams, it competed and won, and because it earned its position. Its position is not a privilege to be justified, but an achievement to be defended. And any challenge to the arrangement is not a political demand, but an attack on merit itself, which is to say on fairness, which is to say on the good. You cannot argue a class out of a position it believes it deserves. There is nothing to negotiate. The claim is not that they should rule because they are strong. The claim is that they should rule because they are right, and the credential is the proof. And the man who invented the word for this saw exactly where it was going and was horrified. In 1958, a British sociologist named Michael Young published a book called The Rise of the Meritocracy. He coined the term, and he wrote the book as a satire, a dystopia composed as a report from the future, describing a society that has sorted everyone by tested ability into a rigid hierarchy, and Young's argument was that such a society would be crueler than the aristocratic one it replaced. Under the old order, the person at the bottom could believe the system was unjust, and that belief preserved their dignity. Under the new order, there is no such comfort available, because the hierarchy claims to be an accurate measurement of your worth, and if you are at the bottom, the system has informed you, with data, that you belong there. Young watched his warning get adopted as an ideal by politicians of every party for the next 4 decades, and in 2001, an old man by then, he published a piece complaining bitterly that they had misunderstood him entirely, that he had meant the word as a caution and it had been taken as a compliment. He died a few months later. The word he invented to describe a nightmare is now the highest praise our institutions can pay themselves. Think about how many names you already know for this thing, without ever having been told they point at the same object. On one side of the political map, people talk about the deep state, the permanent unelected government that supposedly rolls on regardless of who wins the election. Somewhere near them, others talk about the swamp, or the uniparty. The idea that the two parties are a single governing blob wearing 2 jerseys. In foreign policy circles there is a half-joking, half-serious term, the blob, used even by insiders to describe the permanent establishment of officials, experts and think tank veterans who staff the national security apparatus across every administration and who all, mysteriously, seem to believe the same things no matter who the public elected. Among a certain kind of online dissident there is the cathedral, a name for the loose alliance of universities and media that manufactures respectable opinion and quietly sets the boundaries of what a serious person is allowed to think. On the left there is the professional-managerial class, the same phrase the Ehrenreichs coined, now hurled as an insult at technocratic liberals, and underneath all of them, older and vaguer, the words everyone reaches for when they run out of specific ones. The establishment, the elites, the system. Them, every one of those names is a person or a movement standing in the dark, running their hands over the same enormous animal and describing the part they happen to be touching. The foreign policy critic feels the trunk and calls it the blob. The populist feels a leg and calls it the swamp. The online reactionary feels an ear and calls it the cathedral. The disillusioned leftist feels the hide and calls it the professional-managerial class. They are enemies. They would never sit at the same table. And they are all, without realizing it, describing the exact structure Burnham drew in 1941, the rule of a credentialed administrative class that controls without owning and governs without being elected. Take the proliferation of names as confirmation rather than confusion. When people who agree on nothing else keep independently discovering the same shape, the shape is real. But here is the trap, and it is a beautiful one, the kind of trap that looks exactly like freedom. Because each of those names is coded to a political tribe, each one is automatically dismissed by the other tribes as a paranoid fantasy. Say deep state, and half the country stops listening. Because deep state has been claimed by a particular politics and tagged as a conspiracy theory. Say the cathedral, and almost everyone stops listening. Because the phrase belongs to a corner of the internet most people find repellent. Say professional-managerial class in the wrong room, and you will be accused of doing the right wing's work for it. Every available name for the ruling class has been preloaded with partisan meaning, which means that the moment you use any of them, you have picked a side, and half your potential audience has filed you under crank and moved on. The naming itself has been turned into another front in the culture war, and the culture war is the single thing the managerial system manages most expertly of all, because as long as the two halves of the country are screaming different names at the same animal, neither half can ever assemble the majority it would need to do anything about it. The thing hides not by being unnamed, but by being overnamed, drowned in a dozen tribal labels that cancel each other out. And I want to be careful and honest here, because this is precisely the moment where this kind of talk usually curdles into something stupid and paranoid. And I refuse to insult you with the stupid version. The conspiratorial deep state, the one with a secret command center and a coordinated plan and a list of names, mostly does not exist, and the people selling it to you are usually selling something. There is no cabal meeting in a room, there is no plan. And that sounds like the reassuring part of the story. It is the disturbing part, because a class that coordinates without a conspiracy, that acts in concert without a single meeting, that produces the same opinions and the same interests in 100,000 people who have never spoken to each other, is far harder to fight than a cabal. A cabal you could expose. You could name the members, publish the minutes, arrest the ringleaders. But there is no cabal. There is only a class, a vast body of people with the same training, the same credentials, the same incentives, the same understanding of how a reasonable person thinks, moving in the same direction the way a flock of birds turns in the sky without any bird giving an order. You cannot arrest a flock. You cannot subpoena an incentive structure. And you cannot vote out a way of thinking that has been installed, gently and completely, in every institution your society depends on to function. Therefore, the attempt to fight the ruling class by naming it precisely, by finally getting everyone to see the same animal, fails. And it fails in a way that deepens the whole mystery rather than solving it. Even perfect vision would not help, because the problem was never that the thing is hidden. The problem is that it has no head to cut off, no center to seize, no ringleader to expose. It is distributed across millions of well-meaning professionals who would each be genuinely baffled to be told they are part of a ruling class, because from the inside it does not feel like ruling. It feels like doing your job well. It feels like being reasonable, and you cannot start a revolution against reasonableness. But people have tried. Over and over, in country after country, in the last decade especially, movements have risen up promising to break the managerial state, to drain the swamp, to take back control, to hand power back to the ordinary people it was taken from. Some of them won. That is the part almost nobody thinks through. Some of them actually won. And what happened next is the most quietly devastating thing in this entire story, because it is where you find out that even winning does not work. Picture what it actually looks like when an insurgent wins. A movement runs against the entire apparatus, promising to tear it out by the roots and hand the country back to the people. It captures the presidency, or the Prime Minister's office, or a commanding majority in the legislature. The crowds are enormous. The mandate feels total. And then the winners walk into the building to take command of the state they just conquered, and they discover the thing that every insurgent discovers, the thing the theory predicted from the beginning. There is almost nothing there to seize. Consider the raw arithmetic of it, because the arithmetic is the whole story. The permanent civilian workforce of the United States federal government runs to around 2 million people. 2 million administrators, analysts, regulators, and specialists who do not change when the president changes, who cannot be fired without cause, who have their own professional norms and their own understanding of what a competent government does, and who will still be sitting at those desks long after the current occupant of the White House is gone. And how many people does a newly elected president actually get to bring in and place on top of that apparatus? Roughly 4,000. 4,000 political appointees to sit atop an ocean of 2 million permanent staff. The insurgent wins the election and inherits command of an organization in which the people loyal to the new direction are outnumbered by the permanent professional class by a ratio of something like 500 to 1. You did not conquer the state. You were handed a lanyard and a corner office at the top of a building that will keep running exactly as it was designed to run, by the people who were always running it, regardless of what you promised the crowd. This is why the revolts fail even when they win, and it does not matter which direction they come from. A right populist movement wins on a promise to drain the swamp, and 4 years later the swamp is measurably larger, because you cannot fight a 2 million person administrative class with 4,000 appointees, most of whom, in order to actually accomplish anything, have to rely on the very civil servants they were sent to overrule. A left populist movement wins on a promise to break the grip of technocratic elites and deliver real change. And it discovers that to build anything at all, to run the new programs and administer the new spending, it needs administrators, planners, experts, managers, which is to say it needs the exact class it ran against, because that class is the only group that actually knows how to make a modern state do anything. The insurgency cannot govern without the managers, and the moment it staffs itself with managers in order to govern, it stops being an insurgency against the managerial class and becomes just another managerial faction with a different slogan. The revolt does not get crushed, it gets absorbed. It gets a budget and an office and a set of procedures, and within a few years it has become another department of the very thing it was born to destroy. There is a live experiment in this happening right now, and it is worth watching precisely because it is the most serious attempt in generations to actually break the permanence of the apparatus. The fight is over whether tens of thousands of career civil servants, the ones who write the rules and run the agencies, can be reclassified so that they lose their protections and become removable at will, replaceable by people loyal to the elected administration. Strip away the acronyms and the legal argument, and what that fight is really about is the single most important question in this entire story. Can the managerial class be seized? Can an elected movement finally reach past the 4,000 appointees and take command of the permanent apparatus itself by making the apparatus fireable? The people pushing it believe they have finally found the lever that breaks managerial rule. And maybe they have. But here is the question that should haunt anyone cheering for either side. Suppose it works. Suppose you can now fire the career administrators and replace them. Who exactly do you replace them with? You replace them with other administrators. Loyal ones, maybe, aligned ones, but still credentialed professionals who run the agencies through control of process rather than ownership, because there is no other kind of person who can run a federal agency. You will not have abolished the managerial class. You will have swapped one managerial faction for another and called it a revolution. The apparatus does not care whose loyalists staff it. It has no loyalty of its own, it only has a shape, and the shape survives every change of personnel, because the shape is the thing that has the power, not the people temporarily filling it. This is the moment where you should feel the floor start to tilt, because it is where the thing we have been tracking stops behaving like an institution and starts behaving like something closer to a law of nature. Every attempt to escape it roots back through it. You want to reduce the administrative state, and to do that you need administrators to administer the reduction. You want to break the power of experts, and to make your case you have to marshal your own experts, produce your own studies, credential your own version of the truth, because in a managerial society an argument without expert backing is not even heard. You want to return power to the people, and to organize the people you need coordinators, communicators, strategists, a professional staff, an apparatus, which is to say you need to build a little managerial machine of your own just to fight the big one. The system does not win by defeating its enemies, it wins by being the medium in which all fighting happens, so that every blow struck against it has to be struck with its own tools, in its own language, according to its own procedures, by people who become a little more like it every day they fight. It is the water. Everything swims in it, including the things trying to drain it. And once you see that, a genuinely unsettling possibility opens up underneath the whole story, the one that Burnham circled and Francis broke himself against, and that we now have to look at directly. What if there is no outside? What if the reason nobody can point to the ruling class, name it in a way everyone accepts, seize it, vote it out or overthrow it, is not that it is hidden or clever or protected, but that in a sufficiently complex society there is simply nowhere to stand that is not already inside it? What if the managerial order is not one power among others that you could oppose from some neutral ground, but the ground itself, the operating system of modern life, the condition that any of us would have to use in order to oppose anything at all? That is the thought everything from here is going to sit inside of. But before we follow it all the way down, we have to be honest about something, because a good skeptic is right now formulating the obvious objection, and it is a serious one. Maybe none of this is real. Maybe the managerial class is not a class at all, but a story, a shape people imagine in the noise because they want an enemy with a face. That objection deserves the strongest possible version, and it deserves a real answer, and it happens that the most serious institutions in the country have just spent the last few years testing it in the open, in a courtroom. At the highest level there is. Here is the skeptic's case, put as strongly as I can put it, because if I only gave you the weak version I would be doing to you exactly the thing this whole story warns against. The word class implies a thing that acts. A class has interests, and pursues them, and in the strong version of this theory, the managerial class is a kind of collective agent, steering society toward its own dominance. But look at the actual 2 million people. They do not coordinate. They disagree ferociously among themselves. The category is so enormous that it swallows a rural public health nurse, a software product manager in a coastal city, a mid-level Pentagon analyst, a museum curator, a human resources director, and a tenured sociologist, and asks you to believe that these wildly different people constitute a single ruling class with a shared program. That is a lot to swallow. And Burnham's own terrible track record as a forecaster cuts against the theory here, because if there really were a coherent managerial class steering history, its rule ought to be more legible, more predictable, than the actual chaos of modern politics suggests. On top of that, the fashionable terms for all this, managerial elite, professional managerial class, deep state, have visibly rotted into lazy insults thrown at any educated person the speaker happens to dislike, and a concept that can be used to explain absolutely everything usually turns out to explain nothing at all. Maybe, the skeptic says, there is no ruling class here. Maybe there is just bureaucratic growth, and rising complexity, and ordinary interest group politics, and the plain old class interest of affluent professionals, and we are dressing all of that up in the costume of a secret ruling order because a villain with a face is more satisfying than a system with none. That is a strong argument, and any honest version of this story has to concede how much of it lands. But here is what it cannot explain away, and here is why, after all my own skepticism, I still think there is something real at the bottom of this. The migration of power from ownership to control was documented, with data, company by company, by Berle and Means, before Burnham ever wrote a word. The convergence is not a matter of interpretation either. An ex-Trotskyist conservative and a pair of committed leftists, working from opposite ends of the political universe with opposite goals, independently drew the same map, and enemies who agree on nothing else agreeing on the shape of the enemy is exactly the kind of evidence that is hard to fake. The growth is measured in the pages of regulation, in the share of the workforce, in the raw expansion of the administrative apparatus across a single century, and the objection that this class does not coordinate, and therefore cannot be a class, actually misunderstands how the thing works. A flock of birds does not coordinate. No bird issues orders, and yet the flock turns as one, because every bird is running the same simple program and responding to the same signals, so that coordinated behavior emerges with no coordinator anywhere. That is the managerial class. It does not need a meeting, because it shares a training, a set of credentials, a language, and a structure of incentives so uniform that 100,000 people who have never spoken produce, reliably, the same judgments and defend, reliably, the same interests, all while each one experiences themselves as simply an individual being reasonable. Here is where I land, and I want to be precise, because the precision is the whole point. There is a boring, modest, almost undeniable version of this claim, and there is a thrilling, paranoid, mostly false version, and the tragedy is that the two get constantly confused. The boring version is this. Power in a modern society has migrated, over the last 100 years, away from ownership and away from the ballot box and toward the control of process, credential and administration, and the class that holds that kind of power is enormous, is neither elected nor owned, is remarkably uniform in its outlook, and governs while sincerely believing it is only serving. That version is true. It is measurable. It is barely even controversial once you look at the numbers. The thrilling version, the one with the secret plan and the coordinated cabal deliberately steering the world, is mostly false, and it is the version that gets sold to you. Because a hidden enemy with a plan is exciting, and a diffuse structural condition with no author is not. And notice who benefits from keeping those two versions tangled together. Everyone. The people who want you frightened need the paranoid version to sell you. The people who want you complacent need the paranoid version too, because as long as the only available critique is a lurid conspiracy theory, they can debunk the conspiracy and quietly bury the boring, true, structural claim right along with it. The real thing, the uncoordinated ruling class with no master and no plan, and enormous shared power, is almost impossible to build a politics around, and almost impossible to make anyone care about, precisely because it is too true and not lurid enough. It is the most important fact about how you are governed, and it is boring, and its boringness is its armour. And the courtroom I mentioned is where all of this stopped being abstract, because the most serious institutions in the country recently landed the hardest blow on the administrative state that has been struck in 2 generations. For 40 years there had been a legal doctrine dating from a case in 1984. That told judges they generally had to defer to the federal agencies whenever a law was ambiguous, on the theory that the agency experts knew best. In practice, that doctrine was one of the deepest structural supports of managerial power, because it meant that when a law was unclear, and laws are almost always unclear, the people who got to decide what it meant were the administrators themselves. The agency interpreted the limits of its own authority, and the courts were told to go along. In June, of 2024, the Supreme Court threw that doctrine out in a decision called Loper-Bright by a vote of 6-3, and ruled that judges must now exercise their own independent judgment rather than automatically defer to the agencies. Alongside two companion rulings the same year, it was widely described as the most significant curtailment of the administrative state in decades, a genuine, structural, deliberate strike against exactly the managerial power we have been tracing. If you have been waiting this whole time for evidence that the thing can actually be fought, this is it. It happened. It was real. Score 1, at last, for the enemies of managerial rule. Except, look at where the power actually went, because this is the part that should close the trap for good. The Supreme Court did not take interpretive power away from the agencies and hand it to you, or to your elected representatives, or to the people. It took that power away from one set of unelected, credentialed process-bound, essentially unfireable administrators, the agency experts, and handed it to a different set of unelected, credentialed, process-bound, essentially unfireable administrators. Judges are not the opposite of the managerial class. They are its purest, highest, most rarefied form. There is no group in the entire society more credentialed, more steeped in specialized process, more insulated from the vote, more certain that it is simply applying neutral principles rather than exercising power than the senior judiciary. The great blow against managerial rule was struck by the most managerial institution that exists, decided by the most credentialed people alive, according to the most elaborate process ever devised, on behalf of no one who cast a single vote. Even the rebellion against the administrators was conducted, adjudicated, and won by administrators. There is no outside. There was never an outside. Every lever you could pull to fight the thing is a lever the thing built, positioned exactly where it needs you to reach for it. And that, finally, brings it home, because there is one more administrator in this story that we have not accounted for yet, and you have been listening to it work for the last 2 hours. Me. Everything I have just done, the citing of the papers, the dates, the measurements, the careful weighing of the skeptic's case against the believers, the marshalling of evidence, the appeal to the authority of studies and scholars and courts, the whole apparatus of let me show you the real version that a competent, well-informed person would arrive at, is the managerial method itself. I have spent 2 hours credentialing and understanding and installing it in you. And what you have been doing, listening, evaluating, filing it away, preparing to be the person who now knows the thing that most people do not, is the other half of the same machine. Think honestly about why you started listening to this in the first place. You clicked because the promise was that you would come away knowing something most people do not know, seeing a structure that others walk past blind. You wanted to get to the other side of the velvet rope, to be the one who understands how power really works while everyone else argues about the decoy. And I gave you that. For 2 hours you have had the feeling of seeing clearly, of being let in on the real version. That feeling is not incidental to this story. That feeling is the story. Because the desire you came in with, the desire to know what others do not, to see the hidden shape, to be intellectually ahead of the crowd, to not be fooled, is the founding desire of the managerial class itself. That is the whole psychology of the class in a single reflex. Rule through superior understanding. Authority through being the one who grasps the real structure. Power not from owning and not from being chosen, but from knowing. And the pleasure you have been feeling, the specific pleasure of finally seeing the machine, is the exact pleasure that class runs on. You did not step outside the ruling class by understanding it, you performed its founding gesture. To want to see power this clearly, this coldly, this expertly, is already to want the one kind of power this class has, the power of the person who is not deceived, who sees the process behind the appearance, who knows, You went looking for the ruling class, and the entire time you were looking with its eyes. You may belong to it, not because of your job title, though it is probably that too, but because of the shape of the wanting that brought you here. The velvet rope you thought you were crossing does not have an outside. Everyone who wants badly enough to see what is behind it is already, by the wanting, standing on the inside. And that is why there is no throne in this story to storm, and why I am not going to end by telling you what to do about any of it. The old ruling classes had a king, and a king can be killed, and a crown can be seized. And that is why every old order lived in fear of the mob at the gate. This order has no king. It replaced the throne with a method, a way of seeing and reasoning and administering, and then it did the thing no ancient tyrant ever managed. It installed the method inside the heads of its own subjects, so that the ruled now govern themselves with the ruler's own mind. You cannot overthrow a way of seeing while you are using it to imagine the overthrow. You cannot escape the process by designing a better process. And if, right now, some part of you is waiting for me to deliver the solution, the 5 things you can do, the framework for fighting back, notice what that craving is. It is a request for a procedure. It is the managerial reflex, asking at the very end of a story about the managerial reflex to be handed one more expert prescription to install in one more compliant and well-meaning mind. There is no 5-point plan. The absence of the plan is the most honest thing I can give you. The problem has precisely the shape that turns every solution into another symptom, which returns us, finally, to a frail 77-year-old man standing in the East Room of the White House in 1983, bowing his head to receive a medal from the President of the United States. I told you at the beginning that the scene was strange, that a former revolutionary was being honoured by the head of the state he once tried to bring down. But you can see it more clearly now, and it is stranger than that, and it is the final proof of the entire theory. James Burnham spent his whole life inside the managerial class. He climbed all the way through it. Revolutionary intellectual, Ivy League professor, wartime officer in the intelligence services running psychological operations, founding editor of the magazine that built modern American conservatism, advisor whose strategic ideas shaped a president's foreign policy. He did not escape the thing he named. He ascended it, rung by rung, all the way to the top, and at the top the managerial state pinned its highest honour to his chest for services rendered. That medal was not a contradiction of his theory. It was his theory, completed. The system took the man who had diagnosed it most precisely, absorbed him, turned his cold analysis into a Cold War doctrine, and then thanked him for it with a ribbon and a ceremony. Even Burnham, in the end, became a department. The one man alive who could see the machine most clearly was decorated by the machine for helping it run, and he bowed his head and accepted. The other path was the one Francis took, and you have already seen where it goes. He refused to be absorbed. He went hunting for the single ground the system could not manage away, the one loyalty it could not dissolve into process, and the ground he found was poison, and standing on it did not free him. It destroyed him more completely than any managerial technique ever could have, and it let the system bury his entire framework as the ravings of a bigot, which by the end he was. 2 men who understood this thing better than almost anyone. 2 fates. Ascend it and be honoured. Refuse it and be annihilated. Look as hard as you like at the space between those 2 options. There was never a third one there. In a few moments you are going to close this, and you are going to go back to whatever it is you do, which, if you are the kind of person who listens to something like this all the way to the end, is almost certainly some node inside the apparatus. A desk somewhere in the great machine, and tomorrow you will be competent at it, and reasonable, and you will follow the process, and you will be right to, because the alternative is exhausting, and there is genuinely nowhere else to stand. The class that owns nothing and rules everything will still be there when you wake up, and it will not be a conspiracy arranged against you. It will be the water you have always been swimming in, the medium of your own competence, the shape of your own careful, credentialed, reasonable mind. It was named in 1941. The book was a bestseller, and then it was buried, and the man who wrote it was given a medal by the state he said had already been taken over. You were told your whole life that the people in charge are the ones who own the most, so that you would keep your eyes fixed on the owners while the administrators ran the world. And you went looking tonight for the people who are actually in charge. You were looking with their eyes.